Hi everyone, Stefan here. Today we are going to talk about chess strategy, how to improve at it, and basically how to play middle games better. Chess middle games can be roughly divided into three categories: tactics, strategic play, and positional play. When I say strategic play and positional play, those can intertwine, and some elements are going to be the same. But strategy and positional chess apply to improving pieces, improving your position, improving your pawn structure or not making it worse based on planning. So it's different than tactics, which I covered in the previous video in this series, where you could see that tactics are well cases during the game where you can get an immediate gain, either material or any other sort of advantage, by finding a combination of moves that provides that. So today we're focusing on strategy. I have prepared resources given by the most prominent authors in chess during the last 60 years and the top coaches, and I've assembled what I think are good guidelines to improve at chess strategy. A disclaimer, this isn't a magic pill you can take to lose 50 pounds. That doesn't work. This is going to be rigorous exercise, an equivalent of a rigorous diet with exercise in order to lose weight slowly. So there is no magic button you can press to get better at chess strategy quickly. It's an incremental process, and we're going to see what we can do to accomplish that. So let's start. I would like to start with Jonathan Rownson, who is one of my favorite authors, and his two books, Chess for Zebras and Seven Deadly Chess Sins, are great books. He says in Chess for Zebras, the heart of the matter is that chess understanding involves using a highly imperfect instrument, yourself. And what he means by that is that every human being tries to understand the information they read or that they are trying to learn in their own way. To put it more technically, we construct our understanding of positions, which means using what we have, however imperfect, to make sense of what we are given. Now, that means that there are preconceived notions in our mind. Our minds have been cluttered with tons of rules. For example, when your opponent plays on the flank, you strike in the center, or if you have a queenside pawn majority, you can win by queening your pawn. That works in theory, but not always in practice. So what he's trying to say is that we are, as human beings, imperfect, and based on our prior knowledge or ignorance, we have a bias, or we are inclined to have a bias in certain positions, which could lead us to make incorrect decisions. So he goes on to say, this means that real learning is often a painful process because you are not just collecting new ideas and stacking them up in some sort of expanding cognitive warehouse. It means that there is also unlearning. And that's the most beautiful thing about that book. So he says, it means that learning is hard because you have to unlearn so many of the things that made sense to you. So if you think something is true, and of course it's not applicable to all chess positions that are similar, then unlearning it is the first step to being objective in chess positions. And as we're going to see, some other authors say, chess is moving away from those general principles more and more, and especially chess middle games and chess strategy, which is very hard to define. If you talk about the opening or the end game, there are certain rules that nobody can contradict. The opposition is always going to be relevant. 2 + 2 = 4. In the opening, you want to take the center and develop your pieces, or give your opponent the center just to break it later. If you don't follow those principles, you're not going to do well. In the middle game, sticking to principles could be a bad idea. So he says it means that learning needs resilience because things won't always make sense straight away, and you might have to be willing to feel stupid or ignorant before things begin to clarify again at a higher level. Indeed, you have to come to believe that the kind of learning that is most useful for chess improvement is actually unlearning. And trust me, I've read this book 3 or 4 years ago. It takes time to understand what he means by unlearning. So let's say you play a tournament game. A beginner will say, I lost because I hung my queen. An advanced player will say, I lost because I allowed my opponent to trap my queen was misplaced, I didn't centralize it, my pawn structure was bad. A very good player will know exactly what led to the precarious position of the queen, and in the end, that hung the queen. So there are levels of understanding. So what we need to do is take a middle game, dissect it, figure out where we went wrong, which is hard in itself, but then we also need to interpret which preconceived notions and rules and general principles that don't really apply made us make that decision. And this is a great quote from the book where he says, when you know what you know, bishops are bishops, knights are knights, and pawns are pawns. When you start to unlearn, that's no longer true. And when you feel the benefit of unlearning, it begins to make sense again. So I don't know if you drive a car. I got my license just a year ago. And I came there as a 30-something-year-old, and I told the guy, the instructor, I don't know anything, I've never driven a car. And he said, great. Why am I saying this? If you had a student, or if you were trying to learn chess, and you knew absolutely nothing, not even how the pieces moved, your mind would be much easier to shape in a good way. So if you gave a player who doesn't know the rules of chess for training to Jakob Agard, Jonathan Rownson, Mark Dvoretsky, Garry Kasparov, Tal, Fischer, and Botvinnik, they would make a world champion out of that person. That person could be, well, they wouldn't even have to be too intelligent or above average. And that's what Rownson is trying to say. Now let's continue with Watson. By the way, his name is John Watson. Sherlock Holmes is my favorite fiction of all time. He says in his Chess Strategy in Action, this and other evidence indicates to me that players are much more tolerant of ideas that used to be rejected on principle. Such openness has been increasing throughout the last century, but recently it has accelerated, in part due to the availability of computer analysis. The latter resource has freed players to try out almost any absurd-looking set of moves. So, and that you can definitely see in games of strong players. They do not follow general principles if the position on the board requires them to do something else. I think the stronger you are, the easier it becomes to move away from knowledge you read somewhere and to actually focus on the position. Because all these rules, and I'm going to show you what the best authors throughout history say makes chess strategy, all of these rules are made up so that humans could have an easier time understanding the topic. Why are engines stronger than humans? Because they can compute a million times better. That's not the point. They don't have any biases. They don't start looking for ways to queen a pawn if they have a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side. They think about the position, they look at it objectively, and they find the best idea. If humans could get away from all of those notions, they would be stronger. And that's what Watson is trying to say. Now let's move on to Jakob Agard. As you probably already know, Jakob Agard is my favorite chess person in the world. I have actually been going through his attack and defense this morning. So in his book, Strategic Play in the Grandmaster Preparation series, this book is in the same series, he says in the introduction, I'm not sure that the title of this book is entirely accurate. He thinks he should have perhaps called it Complex Positions. But here's the thing. Skills exercised in this book are to a great extent the same ones used when we make strategic decisions. Okay? The combination of calculation, positional evaluation, and long-term abstract thinking. Those are the three things he thinks combine good strategic thinking. So, of course, every strategic decision needs to start with a plan. You plan things out long-term. Once you find the plan, you need to back it up with concrete analysis, because if, let's say, your opponent's king on is on g8 and your plan is checkmate, but you only have a knight on f3, then that plan surely cannot be backed up by calculation, because it makes no sense. So this is a thing I would like to give you as an introduction into what strong coaches and authors think is relevant for being good at chess strategy. This graphic here is by Hansen, and he gave it in his Foundations of Chess Strategy. It's a fairly recent book, 20 years old, and I think he is on point with the factors he thinks should decide a player's ability to make good strategic decisions. First of all, there are the obvious ones: material, positional factors, and the initiative. And that's something that Garry Kasparov used in his defining of chess into three elements: material, quality, and time. So the initiative could be time, positional factors could be quality, and material is material. So obviously, if you have extra material, then we don't really have to talk about it. We're talking about positions that are balanced materially. So he divides material into absolute force exchanges and positions after a queen exchange. And I think that's interesting. Looking at exchanges as something that defines the nature of the position after the exchange is an extremely important element of understanding positions. For positional factors, he talks about space, pawn structure, key squares, and the center. And these are, I think, what most people would associate with chess strategy. And for the initiative, I mean, you should read the book, but there are elements of initiative that he thinks are important. And among them is king position and coordination of pieces, which I think are applicable to all players, because you need to factor in king safety and king positions and whether your pieces are good or bad when formulating a plan, any plan. Now let's go back in time. If you've read my system, and that used to be one of my favorite books, I no longer like it. I don't think it's relevant, and I think there are far better books out there, although if you were born 150 years ago, it's the best book you can get 100 years ago. So Nimzowitsch divides strategy into 8 factors, you could say: the center, open files, 7th, 8th ranks, passed pawn, pin, discover, check, exchange, pawn structure. I think he has it a bit wrong. First of all, open files and play on the 7th and 8th rank are connected, and they're not the same thing, but if you control a rank, you may infiltrate. If you don't, you won't. Then the pin and the discover check are tactical elements. Exchanging is definitely out there. The pawn structure is out there. The center is out there. And the passed pawn is both tactical, a positional, and a strategic element because it can decide the outcome of the game. And based on having, let's say, a protected passed pawn, you formulate your strategy because that's one of the biggest assets. So I think an important point that I couldn't find the quote on, but I'm sure most authors would agree. When formulating a plan, you need to figure out what you're playing for. If you have a protected passed pawn, now I'm just mentioning this as an example because Nimzowitsch wrote that. If you have a protected passed pawn on d6 and you're white, you're not going to plan to expand on the queen side. You're going to plan to use the e7 and the c7 squares for your rooks. You're going to plan to push that pawn and queen, and so on. Dorfman, who is another renowned coach and author, I would say 40, 50 years after Nimzowitsch, divided strategy into these 4 elements: king position, material, better position after exchange of queens, and pawn structure. I think this is very rough. I don't think it's correct at all. But I wanted to mention it because I wanted to show you the evolution of thinking. And if we go back to Hansen, his is way more natural. Now, moving away from the factors on the board, Hansen also mentions the human factor and environmental factors. And those are, of course, always important and applicable to all parts of chess. So, now let's look at what the coaches say. There is a famous book, well, used to be famous, written in 1964 by Keres and Kotov. A great book, definitely a great book and an easy read. I think that's probably my favorite thing from everything that Kotov's ever written. So, they say, and I'm not sure which one of them wrote this exact quotation, but to play from move to move is obviously reprehensible, but the tendency to drift is more insidious. In fact, we may be conscious that we are so doing and still continue to commit the crime. For crime it is, and the sign of its importance and its ill effect on one's play lies in the undoubted fact that the great players rarely drift. This characteristic is indeed one way of distinguishing the great master from the ordinary player. So, put simply, you should have a plan, and you shouldn't drift away from that plan or change plans too often. This, in modern literature, is no longer the opinion of the top authors, but it makes sense. Today, most people recommend and point out that strong players are strong because of their ability to adapt and change plans from ply to ply if needed. You adapt to the position on the board. Harrison could have continued to say, how does one form a plan in the first place, if the plan is the most important thing? It's all very well talking of dangers of too many plans, but what are the grounds upon which a single plan is formed, where in fact does the inspiration lie? And then they say, this plan in fact must arise naturally and logically out of the opening. Here is the clue to the methods one must use in forming a plan and the way one must develop this plan. I've said that what sort of influence the opening will have, this is a poorly translated book, excuse me, will have on the middle game depends on the nature of the opening one chooses. And in this respect, the pawn skeleton is one of the utmost significance. And I would say this is absolutely true, although there are other approaches, but using the pawn structure as a basis for coming up with a plan, and what they say, the pawn structure depends on the opening, so of course using the opening to formulate a plan could be reductio ad absurdum, is a great way to understand the position, because the pawn structure will tell you where the pieces should go, why the king is safe or unsafe, whether you should attack or defend, where are the pawn breaks, what do the endgames look like, therefore should you be trading off or avoiding exchanges, who has more space, and stuff like that. So forming a plan based on the pawn structure alone, of course, isn't optimal, but it's a good way to start. Let's continue with Ludek Pachman. This is another book from the 60s, and I really love the book. He says, the ability to calculate correctly is undoubtedly a necessity for the top-class player, but it is not the only one, and certainly not the most important difference between the master and the average player. And I think I agree with that. There are many players who have a good command of the art of accurate combinations, but who will never reach master strength. I know a few examples, I'm not one of them. For they lack the ability to, I have the opposite problem. My ability to calculate is poorer than my strategic understanding, I think. For they lack the ability to conduct the entire game on the basis of a correct plan laid out in advance. The calculation of particular variations is only possible and necessary in certain clearly defined positions. In most cases, one's overall plan of play is the correct pointer to finding a given move. And I have been testing this in my own way with my students and during my own training. I came up with a system in which you can divide the middle game, anything between late opening and simple endgames basically, into 3 types of positions. And I've never seen this written down or recommended by anybody else, so this is my idea. If you want to skip ahead a minute, you can. This is not what the top coaches say, but I found it very, very useful in my own training, and my students have had remarkable results. So the first type of position that occurs frequently is what I call rookie 1 positions. And what I mean by rookie 1 is those are simple positions that do not require deep planning, deep thinking. They also don't require calculation. There's an open file, the open E file, you've castled, you go rookie 1. Or, for example, you're playing a queen's pawn opening, you go queen c2 to connect your rooks. Those types of rookie 1 positions are positions in which simple logical moves cannot hurt you. The second type of position is what I call brute force positions. Maybe there's a better name, but this is my name. So those are positions in which there are no easy moves, Planning is irrelevant because planning ahead, you don't have time for that because it's so tactical, so sharp, and so complicated that all you can rely on is precise calculation of variations, looking at your opponent's threats, finding the correct candidate moves. Brute force positions must be solved with calculation alone. Of course, factoring in evaluation and planning out in positions that could occur is helpful, but given that our clock time is limited, recognizing that it's a brute force position and moving on to calculating immediately is what helps. And the third type of position is by far the most frequent type. I call those complex positions. Those are positions in which there are no simple moves you could make without thinking. So no rook e1, no queen c2. And there are positions in which there are no forcing moves, neither king is unsafe, and it's not clear that you have to calculate something. That being said, you may find that from a complex position, you find yourself actually calculating for half an hour because you figured that there is something in the end, or you found the line 5 moves deep. But in general, complex positions must be approached by planning ahead, and that's proper strategy. So for those, I use Jakob Aagaard's blueprint from his positional play. I answered, if I think something is a complex position, I answer Aagaard's 3 questions. Where are the weaknesses? What's the worst placed piece? What does my opponent want to do? If there are no simple moves, if the position doesn't seem to require calculation, and if you answer those 3 questions correctly, it's extremely likely that you will find a plan that's playable at least, but probably really good. Now, of course, you could answer those questions incorrectly. You could be extremely bad at chess and maybe you don't understand what's going on, so answering them will not help. But for anybody who has some skill, those will be helpful. Now let's go back to what the coach would say. So I wanted to throw this in because during the last 2 months, I've been testing this out with my students and on my own training, and it has helped a lot. So when you find yourself in a middle game position, I have a 3-step approach. Firstly, evaluate. And that's going to tell you what you're playing for. Are you worse, better, equal, why? Secondly, categorize. Is it a rook e1 position, brute force position, or a complex position? That will tell you whether you need to make a good move quickly, simple move quickly, calculate your brains out, or find a long-term plan. And then after that, based on the category, I look for candidate moves and decide. Now let's move on. Bachmann continues to say, it might be thought that the strategical goal in every game was the mating of the opposing king. And indeed, such a superficial comprehension of strategy prevailed in the early days of the modern form of chess. Nowadays, however, technique has improved and ideas have become more profound. In the games of good players, even the winning of a weak pawn no longer appears with frequency as a strategic goal. More often, a small positional advantage, such as control of an open file, the weakening of an opposing pawn, or the creation of a passed pawn. Generally, the higher your skill level and your opponent's skill level, the smaller advantage you're going to be planning to get and playing for. Of course, when, I don't know, Magnus and Anand played, Anand didn't hang a piece. Magnus beat him by building on small advantages incrementally. So the stronger you are, the plans become more complex, or the stronger your opponent is. So try to think of a chessboard, when you think of strategy, try to think of every type of weakness. What he mentions here, an open file, an outpost for a knight is a weakness, shutting in your opponent's bishop is a weakness, opening your bishop is an advantage, securing the king, and so on and so on. There are many, many types of plans you could play for. Bachmann says about strategy and generally about any position, a character of a position is determined by the following factors. Material relationship, so whether one side has more material, and also material imbalances should be thrown in here. The power of individual pieces, so what Kasparov called quality, the quality of individual pawns, the position of the pawns, the pawn structure, so that's static. He should have pointed that out. The position of the kings, so king safety, and cooperation amongst the pieces and pawns. And I think this is a relatively good division, although not optimal. Now, Lev Albert with Palatnik wrote a book, Chess Strategy for the Tournament Player, and it came out in '97. I think it's still relevant today. It's a pretty interesting book. They define strategy as the art of forming an overall plan. So agreeing with Kotov and Keres, frequently the fact that correct strategic planning dictates the choice of objectives is understated. Strategy is the grand scheme for a game. I would say that this is incorrect, or there are then two strategies. The grand strategic scheme of a chess game is to checkmate your opponent, but we need to come up with smaller schemes, smaller strategic plans on each ply, if necessary, in order to conduct the game well. He says strategy is the opposite of tactics, which are the application of a short series of forced moves to achieve an immediate improvement. The words positional and strategic are frequently used interchangeably. The very first step in composing an appropriate strategy is to evaluate the position correctly. And that's what I said my first step was when approaching any position that's not an opening position or an endgame position. Evaluate based on that, you continue. Because if you think you're losing, you're not going to think about mating your opponent or whatever else. You're going to try to save yourself. Now, a game by Cousins, or I'm not really sure how to, a book, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. It's called Lessons in Chess Strategy. It's a great book from the 60s. He says, though impenetrable complexity nearly always makes it out of the question to analyze in detail a dozen moves ahead of the chessboard, it is perfectly feasible to look a dozen moves ahead and visualize the kind of position one is aiming for, the kind of pawn structure one can try to build, the kind of advantages one may seek to acquire, and the kind of difficulties one may create for the opponent. This is strategy. So, and he puts it perfectly. It's not calculation. You don't have to look at exact variations, but you look 10 moves deep in order to evaluate the future position, and based on that evaluation, come up with a plan. That may not be forcing, that may not happen. Your opponent's next move could just, you have to set aside that plan, that could happen. But what he says, planning ahead and looking 10 moves ahead doesn't mean calculating correctly 10 moves ahead. It's visualizing possible positions. Rownson, in his Foundations of Chess Strategy, says, and this is one of my favorite things you'll see in this video, grandmasters are very good at noticing these emergent opportunities and are consequently always ready to change their plans. And that's true. And it opposes what Kotov and Keres wrote. However, the big question is when you should spend time and energy conceiving long-term strategic plans, and when you should prioritize concrete calculations, the tactical and operational aspects of the game. He says, the easy answer is that you should always be on the lookout for strategic shifts, but in practice, this is often not very practical, although obviously experience plays a big part here. So what he says is good players have an easier time adapting to changes in a position, which is normal. A good practical rule of thumb can be, next one. If the position is very simple, technical accuracy is the most important point on the agenda. Okay, so I find this tip very helpful. As outlined before, such positions are not really strategic in nature. If, on the other hand, the position is very complex and tactical, concrete calculations take precedence over strategic considerations, as the number of emergent options is so large that it's impossible to control them all and to boil them down to an intended strategic plan. So in a sense, that's exactly what I do now. Figure out whether it's sharp and tactical or slow and static in a sense. He calls it simple. If a position is simple, there's probably no need to calculate, although that's not always true. But it's a generalization that could help you. Now, Watson, in his Chess Strategy in Action, says probably the most important distinction that I should make is between the belief that valid rules exist and the idea that there are specific generalities that are losing relevance. So, and the quote goes on, in today's game, because players don't think in terms of them. But the most important part is the first segment of the quote. So he too is challenging the preconceived notions. So I would once again like to highlight the fact that you don't have to stick to what you know. You need to look at a position objectively and make your decisions based on that. The closer you come to forgetting everything you've been told about general principles, you'll have a better chance of finding a good move in a position in which they don't apply. I'm not saying they never apply, but in many positions we make a mistake because we try to apply principles that are not applicable. Okay, so let's continue with Suba. Suba is a Romanian chess player, and the introduction to his dynamic chess strategy is just wonderful. He talks about how his first tournament, he had 0 out of 13. And he got promoted to the second category so that he could play. And they demoted him immediately after the tournament because he had 0 out of 13. He, of course, became a very strong grandmaster later on and one of the top Romanian players of all time. And his book, Dynamic Chess Strategy, is extremely interesting because his approach is different to, well, everybody's. He basically divides strategy, dynamic strategy, into elastic and non-symmetrical pawn structures, pressure or control towards the center, non-symmetrical plans of attack, piece positioning according to pawn structure, opponent's plan, piece positioning, pairs of related pieces, and mutual positioning, and evaluation of time. So, and point 6, which I managed to cut off, is classical principles are also important, so you shouldn't forget them. But basically, he says before he writes this that strategy isn't what people think it is. It doesn't have to be dry maneuvering and slow play. Strategy can be dynamic. And there's a great book by Gelfand, Dynamic Decision Making in Chess, that I think it greatly improves on Suba's book. But give the man a break, this was written 30 years ago. So Suba says, dynamic strategy is not only a reconciliation of classical strategy with the new problems raised in competitive chess, but also an escape from the circle of slow maneuvers which rarely produce more than half points. That's not necessarily true. Look at Karpov games, but he's trying to illustrate the point. It aims to promote fighting and uncompromising chess. It's an attempt to revise the standard static conservative opinion on what strategy should be. And then he says a collection of rules about the center, fixed pawn structure, open lies, blah, 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 blah. Everything we saw Dorfman, Nimzowitsch, and Kotov say previously. Let's continue with Valery Bain. This is a book for beginners. It's called Back to Basics Strategy. It's an okay book, though. So he simplifies strategy by saying, strategy concerns itself with preparing favorable circumstances for decisive tactical or technical operations. And I think this could be the most perfect definition yet, because that's just true. You cannot contradict it. Strategy is slowly trying to do something that will give you gains, either material gains or a different type of positional advantage. So strategy is preparing for tactics. And that's, you could supplement that with Bobby Fischer's quote that tactics flow from a superior position. So you need strategy in order to prepare tactical operations. He says then, in chess, strategy is concerned precisely with questions about the quality of the position. That is, it's concerned with what would lead to good positions. And that's, after you evaluate a position, based on your evaluation, you need to answer that question in your head. Not exactly what would lead to a good position, but what could improve my position. That's the step one of making the plan. What do I want to achieve? What would make my position better? Let's continue with Edward Lasker, not to be confused with Immanuel Lasker. He lived about 100 years later, or 80 years later. In his book, Chess Strategy, he says on strategy, the following definition may not be out of place. Strategy sets down the whole of the problems which must be solved in war in order to attain the ultimate result aimed at. Tactics solve such problems in various ways and according to the conditions prevailing in the particular case. Sound strategy, when setting the task, must never lose sight of tactical practicability, and only a thorough knowledge of tactical resources makes correct strategy possible. And I couldn't highlight this more. Strategy is meaningless unless you miss one of your opponent's candidate moves and you blunder a pawn. I've been in that situation 100 times. Thinking ahead without making sure and backing it up with calculation is pointless. He says, to play logically means to subordinate all combinations to a leading plan of campaign, agreeing with Cotto and Keres. But there is a difficulty in finding the latter. An unsound scheme, even if worked out to its logical conclusion, can of course be of no value. That's true. All the same, it's better than no plan at all. And in time, one gains by experience and develops a sort of instinct for rejecting from the large number of possible operations all those which, properly countered, cannot bring any advantage. This is utopian and true, of course. He's basically saying if you're good, you're good. But he's correct in saying that planning can be improved with experience. If you analyze your games and you see that you went for the same plan that didn't work 5 times in your last 20 games, well, stop doing that. Next time you see a possibility for that, you're not going to do that. Back to Hansen. Again, his foundations of chess strategy. I wanted to continue the previous quote, although it's a different author, but they complement each other. Certainly, an extremely important aspect of chess is finding the right move in the given position on the board. However, to do so, it's necessary to put on the strategic glasses and determine where you want to go in the long term. Otherwise, the task of determining what the right move is will be impossible. And then he says, it's been known since Steinitz, the first world champion and also the father of modern positional play, that good moves do not come out of nowhere. In chess, there is an inherent logic that prescribes the connection between strategy and tactics. And again, Hansen completely agrees with what I said a minute ago. And it's absolutely true. This is, I think, if you're going to take away one thing from this video, take this. He continues to say, secondly, it's important to notice that chess is not about one plan, but a string of consecutive plans. And I like this a lot. I haven't seen it written about that much. I'm often asked what the main difference between a chess grandmaster and chess amateur is, and I believe it's this. The amateur knows that he has to follow a plan. Grandmasters, on the other hand, are always ready to change their plan according to the circumstances. And he then goes on to say that the opponent plays a crucial role. And that's true. If a grandmaster, I'll again use the pawn majority on the queen side metaphor. If a grandmaster has a 3-2, then okay, he knows that he may be able to create a fast pawn and queen in the long run. But based on what their opponent plays, he's going to adapt and maybe not go for that plan. So the stronger you are, the better you are at recognizing that plans have to change. And of course, based on what your opponent plays, you need to adapt. You need to change your plans. Because if your opponent, if you push c4, you're trying to queen your c-pawn, and your opponent plays, I don't know, queen h4, and there is a bishop looking at h2, you don't play c5 losing, because it's mate. You need to adapt. Hansen then says, therefore, a large part of the planned or intended strategies that a chess player conceives during a game will not actually be realized. And that's the beautiful point that not many people think about, especially not many beginner players. I can tell you that in each and every one of my tournament games, there were 100 more ideas that I never started during the game, that I never played for, than the actual ideas I went for in the game. You plan all the time, and just a small number of your ideas are actually going to become plans and then actually get on the board. At the same time, new strategic possibilities emerge continuously during the course of the game when the intended strategies of the two players collide. This is also true, I guess, in the business world, where strategic intentions and actual behavior are often two very different things. So plan to adapt, plan to plan, plan to change your plans, plan to give up on your plans based on what your opponent does if the situation changes. A great book written by Kosikov called Elements of Chess Strategy is something you should definitely read if you have the time and the resources. He says, so it's with the study of the middle game that the two-dimensional approach isn't enough. And he talks about how simple it is to study the endgame and the opening two-dimensionally because there are rules you can follow. So that's what came before. To put this into context, you need to perfect your abilities in a large number of directions, and that's true. There is the development of your combinative vision and the technique of calculating variations. There's the study of typical positions, and then he gives an example of a Sicilian structure, and the ways of handling them. There are situations involving defense, the initiative and the struggle for it, the need for restraint, and so forth. There are positions where the material balance has been disturbed. There are elements of chess strategy such as open files, weak points, bishop pair, and so on and so on and so on. This is another important point. Chess strategy is not one thing. It's a million small things you get better at. There is no book you can take that's called chess strategy, although many authors have claimed that. You read that, you become good. No. You have to unlearn preconceived notions. You have to learn a million different small things over and over again until theoretical knowledge becomes an applicable skill. Okay, Kosikov then says, what do you think defines a chess player's strength? What distinguishes a grandmaster, shall we say, from a strong amateur? He says, many answers can be given to these somewhat abstract questions. In my view, the answer lies in the ability to assign the right order of priority to the elements of strategy in a particular position. And that's beautifully put. Simply put, a grandmaster will focus on what's important much quicker than me, much quicker than a 2300 player, much quicker than a 1500 player. It's not that they can calculate 100 moves deep, it's that they know what to calculate. It's not that they can make perfect plans, it's that they recognize what they should be planning for. He goes on to say, and to formulate a plan of play accordingly. There are large quantities of such strategic elements in chess, for instance, a weak point, a passed pawn, piece activity, and so on and so on. So strong players are strong because they recognize what to plan for. Kosikov then says, top-class chess players have to behave like first-rate actors in a drama. I love this part. Just as an actor must not only play the role created by the author, but also get inside the personality of the character he is portraying, so a chess player needs to experience the very thoughts, wishes, and emotions of his opponent, envisaging a possible continuation idea or plan for his own side, blah, blah, blah. Once again, think about what your opponent is trying to do. Planning by looking one half of the board makes no sense. Planning without incorporating your opponent's ideas into your plan is probably going to lead to defeat. Just to finish, I want to give you a Nimzowitsch quote that I actually like. All operations should be undertaken with a certain goal, the object of attack in mind. To swim without a goal is strategic confusion, and that's of course true. And one last thing. My second favorite author, John Nunn, wrote in his book, Understanding Chess Middlegames, which I think is one of the best books on middle games for beginners. There are many myths about middle game play. Influenced by some notable writers, generations of players have come to believe principles that are at best partly true and at worst largely false. These myths could be the subject of a whole book. But here I would just like to focus on one example, and then he gives an example how queenside majority described by Steinitz as a big advantage actually made no sense. So take this part away. The things you know, there is a possibility that they are false. There is a possibility that they will hinder your ability to find a good plan. Try to stay flexible. Try to look at each position objectively. And good luck. I hope this helped. I hope you got something from the video. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and stay tuned for more chess.